Alice Sterling and I had been together for 4 years, and we were incredibly in sync. We were so well matched that she fell into the trap of thinking a lifetime with me would be easy. She started flaunting our relationship on Facebook, and before long, the rumors of our upcoming marriage were the talk of the town. Just as things were getting serious, my brother Julian, who had moved to London after his wedding, suddenly got divorced and moved back to Chicago. Alice insisted on picking him up from O'Hare herself, parading him around high-end events, and introducing him to her elite professional circle. The whole city was waiting for me to fall apart and become a local joke, but I honestly felt nothing but relief. Honestly, who would actually want to marry a woman like that? On the day Julian Sterling arrived back in the States, Alice was still in my bed. I had my hands around her waist, pinning her down against the sheets as the morning light filtered in. Her face was flushed, and she was clearly caught up in the moment, but the second that specific ringtone went off, she recoiled like a startled animal and slipped out of my grasp. I reached for her hand, asking where she thought she was going. She brushed me off impatiently, claiming that Julian was calling and it must be something urgent. She scrambled to answer the phone, not even stopping to put on her slippers. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I watched the tension leave her shoulders as her expression softened. She spoke into the receiver in a low, tender voice, telling him he couldn't keep doing this and promising to be there as soon as possible. While Alice was in the shower, I lay there staring at the ceiling, completely lost in my own head. I didn't give a damn about what Julian had told her. I was just thinking about that ringtone. It was the custom alert Julian had set on her phone years ago, right before he left the country. He had told her never to change it, claiming that every time she heard it, she would be forced to think of him. Despite Alice begging him on her knees to stay, Julian had turned his back on her and moved to Europe. Alice had spent that entire night drinking until she was numb, eventually hurling her phone against the hardwood floor and shattering the screen into a million pieces. She regretted it almost immediately, sobbing through the night in a fit of resentment and despair. When she finally got a replacement phone, she became obsessed with finding that specific ringtone again. She tried to convince herself she just needed to hear it one last time to finally say goodbye to her first love. The problem was that she couldn't remember the name of the track. She spent countless nights lying awake, scrolling through playlists, and hoping to catch that familiar melody. It turned into a dark obsession she couldn't shake, and then, out of nowhere, that melody filled the room this morning, jolting both of us wide awake. It turns out she had found it after all, even if she hadn't realized it until that moment. Alice rushed out of the bathroom, throwing on her clothes in a frantic blur. She didn't even look at me as she announced she was heading out and told me not to wait up for her. I called out to her before she could reach the door. Alice, let's just end this right here. To be honest, our relationship had been a blurred, messy disaster from the very beginning. In the early days, whenever someone asked if she and I were serious, she would just shake her head and tell them we were friends with benefits. I never corrected her because, at the time, she wasn't lying. Yet, 2 years into the arrangement, she suddenly started introducing me to people as her boyfriend. I was caught off guard by the change, but I played along and kept my mouth shut. Then, 6 months ago, she out of the blue asked if I would ever consider marrying her. I gave her a nod, and shortly after, I put together a massive choreographed proposal to make it official. She looked radiant that day, and for a while, I let myself get swept up in the fantasy. That ended the moment I accidentally walked in on her talking to her best friend. Her friend sounded completely floored, asking Alice if she was actually going through with it. Alice just gave this vague, hollow smile, the kind of look someone wears when they have finally given up on their dreams. She told her friend that maybe settling down with me wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. After hearing that, a deep sense of unease settled into my bones, making me more restless with every passing hour. I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me until Julian made that phone call this morning. Suddenly, the weight lifted. I realized in that moment that I had no desire to spend the rest of my life with Alice Sterling. What did you just say to me? Alice's frantic expression turned to stone for a split second. Then, a wave of pure resentment washed over her features. She glared at me with a look that could have pinned me to the wall, but I didn't feel a thing. I just looked back at her and smiled. I told her quite clearly that we were done and that this was the end of the line. I honestly thought I would never have to see that expression on her face again, that toxic cocktail of bitterness and desperation in her eyes. It was the exact same look she wore the night Julian walked out on her. The only difference was that this time, she didn't shed a single tear. She stared at me as if she wanted to rip me limb from limb. After a long silence, she snapped her head away and decided to walk out. All I saw was her cold, retreating figure as she whispered something so quiet I almost missed it, telling me that if that was how I wanted it, then so be it. I got the full story about Julian's return from a mutual friend, including all the messy details of his divorce. Apparently, his trophy model wife had cheated on him, claiming it was all in the name of artistic expression. She had been sleeping with her photographer for months. To top it all off, she didn't just break his heart, she cleaned out his bank account before disappearing. I guess us regular people just don't understand the artistic soul. Personally, I found the whole situation hilarious. I couldn't stop thinking about the day he insisted on marrying that girl and moving across the ocean. He called her his muse and claimed she was the only pure thing in his life. He told the rest of us that we were too narrow-minded to understand what true, undying love actually looked like. He went on and on about eternal devotion, completely blind to the fact that their fairy tale was being subsidized by the massive wire transfers my parents sent him every month. The irony, of course, was that I was the one actually generating all that wealth. None of that was my problem anymore. 3 days had passed since I ended things with Alice. I sent her a quick iMessage asking for a timeline on when she planned to pack up her belongings and get out. She ghosted me. I eventually reached out to her personal assistant to handle the logistics, but the guy just stuttered and made one pathetic excuse after another. I didn't have time for games, so I just changed the locks and washed my hands of the whole thing. I had originally bought that house for Alice because she claimed to love the peaceful sound of the river under the bridge. I had spent years commuting from that inconvenient corner of the suburbs just to make her happy. Now that I've moved into a luxury loft right next to my office, I realized just how much of a fool I was. Having an extra 30 minutes of sleep every morning is a game changer. Once I got into the office, it hit me that I was supposed to attend a formal banquet that evening. Alice was supposed to be my plus one, but now I was stuck looking for a last-minute replacement. I told my assistant to find someone professional to accompany me. She looked at me like I had grown a second head and asked if I wasn't going with Alice Sterling. I told her that Alice would likely be attending with someone else. My assistant's face went through a dozen different emotions before settling on pure indignation. She told me not to worry and promised to find me the absolute best companion Chicago had to offer. A few minutes later, she came back looking embarrassed and explained that because of the holiday, every professional agency was booked solid. She asked if I was willing to compromise. I asked her what the hell compromise meant in this context, and she tentatively admitted that the only person available was a girl from a local delivery app. Apparently, her profile mentioned she was into boxing and had a bit of temper. My assistant asked if I was interested, and I just sighed, asking if I even had another option. She just gave me a helpless look and shook her head. I didn't have much of a choice, so I told her book it. When the girl actually showed up, I was floored. There is no other way to put it. She was stunning. She had a killer figure, a radiant smile, and skin that looked like it belonged in a skincare commercial. She had these long, toned legs that could make any man's heart skip a beat. This wasn't a compromise at all. She was a diamond in the rough, a literal goddess working a delivery job. The only downside was that she wouldn't stop talking. She made it clear that her agency didn't usually handle escort services, though she hinted that everything had a price. Then she started worrying out loud about whether Alice Sterling would try to file a complaint against her. She started rambling about her 99.9% positive rating and how a single bad review would tank her year-end bonus. She kept talking until I finally snapped, gritting my teeth and telling her to just be quiet for 5 minutes. She just gave me this innocent look and calmly added that the silence would cost me extra. I took a long, slow breath and told her that if she didn't shut up, I'd file that complaint myself. However, I added that if she actually did her job well, I'd make sure she got a 5-figure bonus. That seemed to do the trick, and she gave me a satisfied thumbs up, promising she was a total pro. But the second we walked into the ballroom, her professional mask slipped and she blurted out, "What the hell?" I felt a headache coming on and told her to watch her language. She just pointed across the room and told me my fiancé was standing right there. Of course, seeing Alice wouldn't have been enough to make her swear like that. The real issue was the man Alice was clinging to, smiling at him with a look I hadn't seen in years. My date looked like she was having the time of her life, whispering that I was clearly being cheated on. I just sighed and told her that the man in question was my brother. That just made her more excited, and she looked like she was about to burst out laughing. She called it a double kill and started giggling. I couldn't tell if I was staying calm because of Leona's ridiculous commentary or if I truly just didn't give a damn anymore. Looking at Alice and Julian together didn't spark any emotion in me at all. I had no intention of making small talk, but Julian spotted me and made a beeline for us. He greeted me with a smug grin, acting like we were the best of friends. He started complaining about how I hadn't been answering his calls since he got back, using that classic passive-aggressive tone of his. He was clearly trying to make me look like the bad guy in front of the crowd. Then he had the nerve to claim that our parents were worried about me. He asked when I was finally going to show up for dinner, implying to everyone within earshot that I was some estranged, ungrateful son who never visited home. While I didn't take the bait, he doubled down, telling me he had even brought a gift back for me. He begged me not to be mad at him anymore, which was just his way of calling me petty and sensitive in front of our peers. The guy hadn't changed a bit since we were kids. He was always the master of playing the victim. Back then, whenever he screwed up, he would apologize so loudly that somehow everyone ended up blaming me for the situation. It took me years to realize he was just a world-class manipulator. I looked him in the eye and asked him exactly when he had supposedly called me. I suggested his memory might be failing, or maybe he just had trouble remembering his brother's number while having no problem remembering his former sister-in-law's. I practically spat the words sister-in-law, and the bile rose in my throat. I could hear the people around us starting to whisper as they realized the scene was brewing. That was when Leona decided to jump in, throwing gasoline on the fire. She demanded to know what he had done to me that required an apology, telling him to stop being so vague and just spill the details. She mocked his gift comment, asking if he was actually sorry or just being a prick. She told him that if he wanted to play the passive-aggressive game, we could just lay all our cards on the table right now and see who was actually at fault. She told him that if he wanted to apologize, he should do it like a man so I could decide whether or not to forgive him. She even joked that if his crimes were bad enough, she might have to take matters into her own hands to see justice served. She was talking so fast that Julian couldn't even open his mouth to respond. Finally, Alice stepped in, coldly demanding to know who Leona was. She looked Leona up and down before her eyes locked onto the way Leona was clinging to my arm. I didn't blink, I just squeezed Leona's hand and took a step toward her. I was about to ask Alice who the hell she thought she was, but before I could get the words out, Leona literally swung me across her body. I was stunned. She moved me from one side to the other like I was a piece of light luggage. For a second, I felt like I'd been teleported. I couldn't believe how strong she was. Then it clicked. My assistant hadn't been using a metaphor when she said this girl was a fierce lady who loved boxing. She was the real deal. Okay, I thought this girl definitely knows how to handle herself. Alice was practically vibrating with rage, telling Leona to get her hands off me. Leona just tilted her head back, looking as proud as a peacock. She made a show of interlocking her fingers with mine, telling Alice that in a civilized society, you aren't supposed to harass other people's dates. Alice was losing it, starting to scream that she was my fiancé, but Julian cut her off before she could finish. Julian looked absolutely panicked as he grabbed Alice's arm, his face twisting into an ugly mask. Alice shot me one final, lingering look before turning her full attention back to Julian. She swallowed her pride and let Julian lead her away by the hand. For the rest of the evening, Leona was the perfect professional. She eventually complained that her face was going numb from having to play the part of the graceful socialite. She told me that acting like a refined lady was the hardest workout she'd had in years. She asked if I was as exhausted as she was, and I had to agree. It's draining to spend hours drinking and making small talk while trying to maintain a shred of dignity. She claimed her soul was drained, which made me want to roll my eyes. The girl had managed to polish off 4 entire Peruvian roast chickens while I was busy networking. I was pretty sure my dignity had left the building the moment she started on the 3rd bird. She seemed completely oblivious to the shocked stares from the other guests. Still, I had to admit the night had taken a toll on me. I handed Leona a generous cash bonus and told her I'd definitely be calling her for the next event. She walked away looking grumpy, repeatedly insisting that she was a decent person and not some hired gun. I just nodded along, promising to recommend her to my colleagues. Once she was gone, I made my way back to my apartment. The moment I stepped off the elevator, I saw Alice waiting for me. She was standing there with a blank expression, watching me approach. I wasn't in the mood for a confrontation, so I tried to brush past her. She stepped right into my path, wrapping her arms around me and refusing to budge. I tried to pry her hands off my waist, but she ignored me, rising up on her tiptoes to try and kiss me. I felt a jolt of pure revulsion and shoved her back, telling her to get the hell away from me. Alice stumbled, but came right back at me like she hadn't heard a word I said. I ended up grabbing her by the collar, holding her at arm's length to keep her from touching me again. Alice looked like she couldn't believe what was happening. She took a step back, her eyes filled with pure venom. She hissed at me, asking if I had actually just laid a hand on her. She sneered, asking who I thought I was. She reminded me that I was the one who used to crawl into her bed like an animal. Even though I was the one who ended it, hearing her say that still felt like a physical blow to the chest. My heart skipped a beat, and I could taste the metallic tang of adrenaline in my mouth. It was a wake-up call. This was how she had viewed me all along. I just nodded and told her she was right. I had been desperate for her once. I admitted that I was the one who started things, but I pointed out that I never forced her into anything. We both played the game, but now I was calling time of death. I told her that if she ever tried to touch me again, there would be serious consequences. Alice and I had known each other since we were in diapers. I was only 3 months older than her, and our families had been intertwined through business and social circles for decades. We practically grew up in the same house. Alice was my first love, but she never had eyes for me. She was always obsessed with Julian, who was the golden boy, always sunny and charming. Compared to him, I was the dull, brooding brother. People in our circle used to whisper that Julian and I weren't even related. It didn't help that we had different last names. There were rumors that I was adopted or some secret love child my father was hiding. For a few years, that gossip was everywhere. When Alice heard the rumors, she actually made Julian apologize to me. He just gave me that smug, punchable grin of his and told me not to take it so seriously. He claimed his friends were just messing around. He acted like he was shocked that anyone would spread such lies. At the time, I thought Alice was standing up for me, but I eventually realized she was just protecting Julian. She didn't want anyone thinking their father had been unfaithful. Alice had always been head over heels for Julian. When he met his soulmate, got married on a whim, and moved to London, Alice spiraled into a dark place. That was the moment I stepped in and made her a proposal she couldn't refuse. Alice told me flat out that she didn't love me. I told her that feelings were irrelevant to the arrangement I was proposing. I didn't need her to love me. I just needed her. Our relationship was never about building a future or falling in love. It was a cold calculation of pros and cons, a way for both of us to get what we needed. Julian had been back in Chicago for 2 weeks now. Alice had spent every waking moment with him, acting as his social director and helping him rebuild his professional network. My mother finally decided to acknowledge my existence, though she only called to scream at me. She demanded to know why I hadn't reached out to Julian or offered him any help. She asked if I even considered myself a Miller anymore. I found the whole thing hilarious, as if acting like a loyal son would suddenly make them treat me like one. I asked her if she actually needed something or if I could get back to my life. My mother knew better than to push me too far, so she finally got to the point. She told me to come over for dinner because she had something to discuss. Then she had the audacity to tell me to bring those designer cufflinks I'd recently bought, claiming Julian would love them. I just laughed and ended the call. It was a hell of a request. Those canary diamond cufflinks were worth a fortune. I knew that going to this dinner was walking straight into a trap. I also knew that if I didn't show up, she'd be at my office tomorrow morning making a scene. I still remembered when Julian decided to marry that model, My mother had stormed in my boardroom and slapped me in front of my staff. She had screamed at me for not managing my brother better. I had turned around and slapped Julian right back, asking him when he had started hanging out with such trash. When I finally arrived at the house, they were already halfway through dinner. It was a perfect little family portrait, with Alice sitting right there with them. Alice froze when she saw me, staring for a long beat before turning away, as if I didn't exist. Julian was the first one up, trying to drag me toward an empty chair. He told me not to be mad at our parents for starting without me. He claimed his blood sugar was low and that our parents were just worried about him getting hungry. My mother didn't even look up, just muttered that if I couldn't be on time, I didn't deserve a warm meal. I just smiled and asked if that was my cue to head out. My mother shot me a murderous look and told me to follow her. I followed her into the kitchen and asked what was so important. She hesitated for a second before dropping the bomb. Julian and Alice were getting engaged. I was speechless, but she didn't wait for a response. She went on a rant about how Alice had always loved Julian and how I had shamelessly stolen her away while he was gone. She actually suggested that I should return Alice to him now that he was back. She reminded me that Alice never loved me anyway and told me to just let it go. Then she had the nerve to tell me to keep the details of my relationship with Alice a secret from Julian. I wasn't the only one who doubted I was their biological son. I'd had my own suspicions for years. When I was a teenager, I actually ran a secret paternity test. The results were a massive disappointment. Turns out I really was stuck with them. My mother was pissed that I wasn't hanging on her every word. She snapped at me, asking if I'd heard a word she said. I was about to respond when Julian poked his head into the kitchen, looking all curious about our secret conversation. He whined about being left out of the loop. My mother's face transformed instantly, her harsh features softening into a doting smile. She lied through her teeth, telling him I had brought him a surprise gift, and then she literally shoved me toward him. Julian looked at me like a kid on Christmas morning. I just smirked and asked him if he was really brave enough to accept a gift from me. His smile vanished as he remembered exactly what happened the last time I gave him something. My mother tried to intervene, but I brushed past her and walked into the dining room. I had a job to do. The table was covered in an elaborate spread. Every single dish was one of Julian's favorites. I turned my gaze toward Alice, and she looked like she'd seen a ghost. She scrambled out of her chair, backing away from me with a look of pure terror. She stammered, asking me what was going on. I just looked at her and gave her a wide, chilling smile. I told her I was doing great, better than ever. Then, I reached down and gripped the edge of the heavy marble dining table. The thing was solid marble and weighed a ton. But I hadn't come to this dinner unprepared. I pulled out my phone and made a quick call, telling Leona to bring the sledgehammer up. Leona was through the front door in less than 10 seconds. The room went silent as everyone stared at her. I just tilted my head back and held out my hand, while my mother started screaming at me to stop. I could hear Alice and my mother shrieking in the background, but I was focused. Just as I was about to take a swing, my father and Julian lunged at me, pinning my arms to my sides. Leona watched them struggle with me for a second before it clicked. She told me I should have just asked her to handle it from the start. She wound up and threw a punch that looked like it could have leveled a wall, slamming her fist into the center of that marble table. A massive crack spiderwebbed across the stone surface instantly. A second later, the entire table gave way with a deafening crash. China shattered, silverware flew, and Julian's favorite dinner ended up splattered across the expensive rug. She had pulverized the entire thing with a single blow. The sound of all that luxury being destroyed was music to my ears. My mother, my brother, and Alice just stood there, frozen in absolute shock. I was the only one smiling as I looked at the wreckage. I guess the fierce lady label was an understatement. She was a force of nature. I made a mental note to double her bonus. I had first met Leona at the security gate of my complex. She was decked out in a delivery uniform, arguing with the guard to let her in. When I asked if she was just a courier, she just laughed and told me it was all the same thing. She admitted she was short on cash, so I told her to get in the car. My original plan was to follow through on our deal and hire her as my personal assistant. I had told her to wait in the car with a sledgehammer, just in case things got ugly. I never expected her to be a one-woman wrecking crew. When my mother tried to lunge at me, Leona stepped in her way like a brick wall. Leona asked her if she wanted to see what her slap felt like. My mother actually flinched, backing away with her hands over her face. She screamed at me, asking if I finally lost my mind. Julian was busy playing the hero, holding our mother and demanding that I apologize. I didn't even look at him. I just told Leona it was time to go. With her walking next to me, nobody in that room was brave enough to try and stop us. We were almost to the car when Alice came running out after us. She ignored Leona entirely, her eyes locked onto mine. She demanded to know who this girl was. I pulled Leona in close and asked Alice what it looked like to her. Her expression soured instantly. As I turned to walk away, she called out to me one last time. She told me that Julian had officially asked her to be with him. I stopped for a second and told her congratulations. She finally got exactly what she wanted. She looked disappointed, asking if that was really all I had to say. I told her that when the wedding date was set, I'd be sure to send a gift. Alice let out a harsh, jagged laugh that sounded more like a sob. She just kept repeating, "Good, very good." As Alice walked away, Leona rubbed her knuckles and commented on how fake the woman seemed. I stayed quiet for a minute before finally asking her how the hell she was that strong. She just grinned and balled her hand into a fist. She did this little playful gesture with her hand against her cheek. If I hadn't just watched her pulverize a marble slab, I would have thought she was being adorable. She told me quite seriously never to underestimate a woman. She started listing off her credentials in Muay Thai, Judo, and Taekwondo. Looking at her, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of family produced someone like her. I asked her right then and there if she wanted the job as my personal assistant. Leona blinked at me and asked exactly how personal this assistant job was going to be. I was stunned into silence. She laughed it off and immediately pivoted to asking about the salary. I asked her to name her price. She held up 5 fingers, looking a bit hesitant. I asked if $50,000 a month would work for her. She looked like she was about to negotiate down, but I just told her it was a deal. Her eyes nearly popped out of her head. I was confused and asked her what she had been about to say. She suddenly lunged at me, wrapping me in a bear hug and burying her face in my shirt. She declared me her new favorite person and promised to be on call 24 hours a day. I felt like I was being crushed and begged her to let go so we could talk like normal people. I knew that after tonight, my life was about to get a lot more complicated. I knew exactly what my parents and Julian were capable of. I could already see the schemes they were cooking up. With Alice thrown into the mix, I just hoped things didn't turn violent. It was 11 at night, and I had just wrapped up a late conference call. I poured myself a glass of wine and was ready to call it night when a friend called. He sounded frantic, asking me why the hell Julian and Alice were making out in the middle of a crowded bar. He reminded me that I'd just proposed to her a few months ago. I told him it wasn't a big deal and that they'd been inseparable since the day he landed. Back then, she used to swear up and down that Julian was just like a brother to her. It made sense why she played it safe for so long. Julian probably hadn't given her the green light yet, and she didn't want to scare him off. Now that he was showing interest, she was clearly ready to jump. Everything finally clicked into place. I asked my friend if the whole group was there, and he confirmed they were. He asked if I was going to show up and confront them. I told him I wasn't coming anywhere near that place. I told him to put me on speakerphone because I had an announcement to make. Aside from our families, this group of friends were the only ones who knew about the engagement. I needed to set the record straight, so I didn't look like the pathetic, jilted fiancé. I told the whole room that Alice and I were officially over. I made it clear that she was free to marry whoever she wanted and that I didn't give a damn. I hung up before anyone could respond. I didn't care if Julian was listening or not. If they wanted to keep him in the dark about our history, that was their problem, not mine. I didn't buy for a second that Julian was completely clueless. I finished my wine, felt the burn in my throat, and was heading to the bedroom when I heard a commotion in the hallway. It was way too late for that kind of noise. I ripped the door open, ready to tear into whoever was making the noise, but I was met with Leona's massive grin. I asked her what the hell she was doing there at midnight. She just pointed to the apartment directly across from mine and told me she was moving in. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. She just kept nodding, explaining that she couldn't be an effective personal assistant if she lived across town. She asked what would happen if I had an emergency in the middle of the night. I was about to tell her she was being insane, but the look in her eyes stopped me. I just sighed and asked her how much the rent was, telling her the company would cover it. She didn't even hesitate. She just whipped the lease agreement out of her bag and handed it to me. Her bluntness was actually kind of refreshing. I told her to keep the noise down because I was going to bed. She made a zip-it motion across her lips and gave me a thumbs up. She gave me this intense nod like she was guarding a state secret. I just shook my head and closed the door. I expected to hear her banging furniture around, but it was dead silent. It was so peaceful that I actually got a good night's sleep. The next morning, I brought Leona into the office with me. My assistant's jaw nearly hit the floor when she saw Leona. Before she could start imagining things, I told her that Leona was my new personal assistant and to get her on board immediately. My assistant just kept nodding, giving Leona a secret thumbs up as we walked past. Every head in the office turned as we walked by. Leona was hard to miss, and the staff was already whispering and grinning behind our backs. I didn't need to be a mind reader to know what the gossip was going to be. Leona didn't seem to care at all. She was actually laughing as we walked into my office. I asked her what she found so funny. She told me that since everyone else was laughing, she figured she should join in. I was at a loss for words. I wondered if she was really that naive or if she'd just spent all her skill points on physical strength. It didn't take long for the staff to realize that Leona wasn't just another pretty face. During my morning briefing, my mother and Julian tried to storm into the conference room, but Leona blocked the door. They were so intimidated that they actually followed her back to my office without a fight. Thanks to her, I was actually able to finish my meeting in peace. When I finally walked back into my office, my mother was already in mid-meltdown. She screamed at me, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. She accused me of trying to ruin their lives. She brought up the promise I'd supposedly made about not telling Julian about my history with Alice. I reminded her that I had never agreed to any such thing. I looked over at Julian and asked him if he really wanted to pretend he hadn't known all along. He finally looked up at me, his eyes full of resentment. He had the nerve to tell me that I'd taken advantage of Alice while knowing she loved him. He asked me if I felt disgusted with myself. I took a step toward him and asked if he had been married to her at the time. He muttered a no. I pushed him, asking if they were even dating back then. He admitted they weren't, so I asked him what exactly she was to him at the time. Was she his girlfriend? His wife? He couldn't even look at me as he mumbled that she was nothing. I let out a sharp laugh and told him that if she was nothing, then he had no right to question me. Whatever happened between Alice and me was absolutely none of his business. And what about him? Wasn't he too busy chasing his soulmate across the ocean to care? Now that he'd failed at marriage, was he really looking for a backup plan? A man as blind and self-indulgent as him had no right to play the devoted lover and judge me. I told him he needed to get his head checked. Honestly, every time he opened his mouth, it was like listening to someone whose brain had turned to mush. Julian's face went bright red, and he started shaking. After a long silence, he finally choked out that it was my fault because Alice told him I'd forced her into the relationship. I just stared at him, stunned that she'd actually gone that far. He tilted his chin up and insisted it was true. I just laughed and told him that was great news. I told him to have her call the police and file a report immediately. I even offered to drive them to the station myself. My mother screamed at me, asking if I had any shame at all. She swung her hand to slap me, but I caught her wrist mid-air. Julian started yelling, asking how I dared to lay a hand on our mother. He called me a parentless bastard and lunged at me like he was going to throw a punch. He froze the second he saw the look in Leona's eyes. She looked like she was actually hoping he'd try something. I let go of my mother's wrist, checked my watch, and asked if they had anything else to say. I gave them a choice: walk out on their own or be escorted out by security. Once they left, I thought I might finally get some work done, but my assistant came rushing back in a few minutes later. Apparently, Alice Sterling had just rejected the merger proposal we'd submitted last week. I asked for her reasoning, but my assistant just shook her head and said Alice hadn't given one. I told her to resubmit it immediately. It was rejected again within minutes. It was obvious that Alice was playing games. I called her and asked what the hell she was trying to pull. She just told me in that soft, manipulative voice of hers that if I wanted to talk, I'd have to come see her in person. Leona drove me over to her office. Before I got out of the car, Leona slipped a small panic button into my pocket. She looked dead serious for once, telling me that if things went south, I should press it and wait 10 seconds. I joked and asked if she was planning on flying into the building. I figured I was overthinking it. It wasn't like I was walking into a trap. I still believed that even in a messy breakup, there were professional boundaries. When I got to her office, Alice was waiting for me. She told me that my father wanted back into the family business. She said that if I stepped down as CEO and handed the reins over to him, she'd move forward with our partnership. I just stared at her and asked if this was Julian's idea too. Alice looked annoyed, asking what Julian had to do with business. I reminded her that I had built this company from the ground up and that it was my grandfather's legacy. I couldn't believe she was actually trying to take it from me. Alice bit her lip and asked why I had to be so difficult. She claimed that if I just gave in, I could finally fix my relationship with my parents. She asked why I was making things so hard. She had the nerve to tell me she was doing this for my own good. She promised that if I walked away, she'd convince my parents to forgive me. She even said that once we were married, none of this would matter. I tuned out most of what she was saying, but the word forgive stopped me cold. I asked her what the hell I needed to be forgiven for. I asked her who gave him the right to offer me forgiveness. I told her she sounded insane. Just because I don't talk about the past doesn't mean I've forgotten what they did to me. My name is Black Miller. I took my grandfather's last name. He had married into the Sterling family, and he and my grandmother had spent their lives building Sterling Enterprises into an empire. They never cared about traditional naming conventions. But after I was born, my grandmother felt a sense of guilt and suggested that I carry on the Miller name. My parents couldn't agree fast enough. They basically handed me over to my grandparents and hopped on a plane to Europe. My grandmother spent the rest of her life regretting that decision, thinking the name change was the reason my parents didn't love me. But the name had nothing to do with it. My parents simply didn't want me. I was an accident conceived while they were backpacking through Asia. They had actually planned to terminate the pregnancy, but by the time they decided, it was too late to do it safely. My mother spent 9 months miserable and sick, and she never forgave me for the stretch marks that ruined her body. She went through a brutal labor that ended in an emergency C-section. She used to tell people that I was born just to make her suffer. She openly admitted that she couldn't love me and that even looking at me made her angry. They finally settled down when I was 3. My grandmother kept trying to push us together, but my mother would just shove me away. She'd scream at me not to touch her expensive clothes because I was dirty. She called me a disobedient brat and blamed my grandparents for raising me wrong. She told everyone I was an ungrateful animal and that I was a lost cause. She decided she needed a do-over, and that's how Julian was born. He was their golden child, their miracle. I wasn't even allowed to be in the same room as him. If I even tried to look at him, I'd get a slap across the face. She'd scream at me, asking who let me upstairs and accusing me of trying to hurt her precious baby. She called me malicious, but I was just a kid who wanted to see my little brother. I was too terrified of her meltdowns to ever try and defend myself. My father would always force me to apologize to her and Julian for things I hadn't even done. My grandparents were the only ones in my corner. My grandmother would shake with rage, telling them that she had raised me and knew I didn't have a mean bone in my body. My father would just try to keep the peace, saying it didn't matter whose fault it was. He'd argue that she was my mother and I should just apologize to make her happy. He even had the nerve to say my grandparents were spoiling me. My grandmother would snap back, asking him exactly how I was being spoiled. She'd remind him that she was the one doing the actual parenting and that I was a good boy. My father would try to argue, but my grandfather would shut him down instantly. He'd declare that I hadn't done anything wrong and wouldn't be apologizing to anyone. He even threatened to kick my parents out of the house if they didn't change their attitude. My grandmother used to hold me and tell me that it didn't matter if my parents didn't love me, because she and Grandpa always would. My grandfather taught me that you have to truly grasp something before you can ever really let it go. He told me not to be afraid of the pain, because a sharp, sudden hurt is always better than a slow, agonizing one. I was happy for a while, but after my grandmother died, my parents tricked me into leaving the country. While I was gone, they kept my grandfather isolated and tried to force him to change his will. My father would scream at him, demanding to know why the company was going to me instead of his own son. They called my grandfather biased and argued that even if I got the company, Julian deserved a massive cut. I felt completely alone in the world during those years. I begged and pleaded with them just to let me go back to my grandfather. I remember one specific day when it was pouring rain and I was standing outside, soaked to the bone and shivering. I was freezing, starving, and so dizzy I thought I was going to collapse right there on the sidewalk. That was when I saw Alice. She was standing there with the rain misting her eyelashes, looking like something out of a dream. She had this look of deep, quiet sorrow in her eyes. She walked up to me and held a small purple umbrella over my head. Suddenly, the sound of the storm faded away, and it felt like we were the only two people left on Earth. She told me she had come to find me. Alice was the one who finally got me home and took me straight to my grandfather's bedside. My grandfather gripped my hand and asked if I actually wanted to run the company. I told him he was going to be fine and that he'd be back in the office in no time. He just patted my head and told me that whether I wanted it or not, I was the only one he could trust with his legacy. He told me the company was everything he and my grandmother had worked for, and he asked me to protect it. He didn't last long after she passed away. Going through those two funerals back to back nearly broke me. Even then, my parents wouldn't leave me alone. My mother tried to force me to sign over my shares, threatening to have me committed and subjected to electroshock therapy if I didn't comply. I refused to give in. They ended up locking me in the basement, only giving me a single meal and a glass of water every 3 days. Once again, Alice was my savior, sneaking food to me through the small basement window whenever she could. When my parents finally tried to have me declared mentally incompetent, she begged her own parents to intervene. She stayed by my side through the whole ordeal, constantly reminding me that I wasn't crazy and that I couldn't let them win. And now, this same woman was telling me that I was the one who needed to be forgiven. I just looked at her and smiled, feeling a sudden, sharp sense of clarity. It was like the clouds had finally parted. Alice stared at me, confused, and asked what was wrong with me. She grabbed my hand and tried to backtrack, claiming she didn't mean it that way. She started rambling about how we were all family and that I should just move on. I was done listening to her voice. I didn't want to hear another word out of her mouth. I told her to get out, and when she looked shocked, I pried her fingers off me and pointed to the door. Alice's expression went cold as ice. She barked an order, and her security team came rushing into the office. She told them to pin me down. It hit me then that these people truly had no limits. I started fighting back like a man possessed. Every memory of the basement, the hospitals, and the restraints came flooding back, fueling my rage. I grabbed a heavy potted plant off the table and swung it in a wide circle to keep them back. I scrambled over the sofa, trying to get to Alice so I could use her as leverage. She was too fast and moved to the other side of the room. The guards closed in, pinning me against the conference table. I managed to land a solid blow on one of them, sending him stumbling back. I used the opening to vault over the table and back myself against the wall so they couldn't get behind me. I had a split second to catch my breath, still brandishing the plant like a weapon to keep them at bay. I reached into my pocket with my free hand, fumbling for the panic button Leona had given me. Alice was screaming at her men, demanding to know how 7 of them couldn't take down one man. She threatened to fire every single one of them. They lunged at me all at once, ripping the plant out of my hands and slamming me against the wall. I finally felt the button and pressed it hard. I started the countdown in my head. Leona had promised me it would only take 10 seconds. I was down on the floor with 3 guys on top of me. Alice stood over me, the sharp heel of her shoe hovering inches from my hand. She sneered, asking me what I had to say for myself now. I just kept counting until I hit 0. The office door exploded inward with a deafening crash. I looked up to see Leona standing there like an action hero. She had literally punched a hole through the solid wood door to get inside. The entire room froze, and Alice backed away in terror. Leona just grinned and commented on how lively the party was. Before the guards could react, she was across the room, tossing them off me like they were made of straw and shoving Alice out of the way. She asked if I was all right. I just gritted my teeth, tried to stop my hands from shaking, and told her we needed to leave. I knew I was on the verge of a total breakdown. Leona, basically had to carry me out of the building. I could hear Alice screaming my name behind us, but I didn't look back. Leona didn't even ask. She just drove me straight to her place. Her apartment was minimalist to the point of being cold. She paced around for a minute before finally handing me a beer. She looked a bit embarrassed, admitting that she didn't have anything else to offer. She started to suggest that I might be more comfortable in my own place, but I cut her off and took the beer. I told her this was fine and that the last place I wanted to be was home. Even though my apartment was literally right across the hall, I couldn't face being alone right then. For the first time since I'd met her, Leona was actually quiet. We sat there on the floor, drinking until the world started to feel a little less sharp. I finally started talking, telling her about my grandfather's final moments and how Sterling Enterprises had been falling apart when I took over. My parents had spent years trying to steal a company that was already dying. My father had run it into the ground before I even got my hands on it. I had spent every day since then just trying to keep the doors open. It was soul-crushing work, and I never let myself take a day off. I was terrified of failing the only people who had ever loved me. Leona listened to all of it before asking me if I'd ever looked at it from a different perspective. Leona told me that my grandfather hadn't been trying to save the business. He had been trying to save me. I didn't get what she meant at first. She pointed out that I was just a kid in college back then, and my parents were already treating me like an enemy. She argued that the company was the only thing protecting me from them. Without that leverage, they would have crushed me. It was the only reason they hadn't been able to completely destroy my life. She said that while the company was a heavy burden, it was also a suit of armor. My grandfather probably didn't give a damn about the money. He just wanted to make sure I survived. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I suddenly remembered the look on his face right before he died. It wasn't the look of a man worried about his business. It was the look of a man who was terrified of leaving his grandson alone with wolves. My voice was shaking as I told her that no one had ever said that to me before. I'd spent years thinking I was just a caretaker for a dying legacy. Everyone else thought I was lucky to inherit the throne, while I felt like I was being crushed by it. That exhaustion had been my constant companion for as long as I could remember. But hearing her say that changed everything. I realized that even though they were gone, my grandparents were still looking out for me. I spent the rest of the night sitting on her living room floor. Leona didn't try to give me any cheesy advice. She just sat there with me until the sun started to come up. Finally, I asked her how she'd managed to get to the office so fast. She admitted she'd been following me the entire time. She reminded me that she was my personal assistant and that there was no way she was letting me walk into that building alone. True to her word, Alice started a full-scale assault on Sterling Enterprises the very next day. She was so hell-bent on destroying me that she didn't even care if she took her own company down with mine. The board was breathing down my neck every hour. Meanwhile, my parents had gone completely silent, just waiting for the dust to settle so they could swoop in and take what was left. Julian actually had the nerve to come to my office and play the concerned brother act. He told me not to be mad at Alice because she was only doing it to help him. He claimed our parents had been sidelined for too long and just wanted a comfortable retirement. I didn't even look up from my desk. I just told Leona to throw him out of the building. Julian stormed out, shouting that one day I'd be the one begging him for help. I took a second to consider if I'd ever be desperate enough to beg him for anything, and the answer was a resounding no. Alice slowly started stripping away my authority at the company, and I didn't do a single thing to stop her. The whole city thought I was finished. What they didn't know was that I was already moving on. Every deal Alice blocked was quietly being picked up by a shell company I'd set up called Beacon Capital. The only reason I was still hanging around was to give my loyal staff time to resign, so they could join me at the new firm. I told Leona that I was actually jealous of the trust fund kids who just got to coast through life. As the guy actually doing the work, I felt like I was getting the short end of the stick. Leona gave me a strange look and asked why I felt that way. I joked that wealth never lasts past the third generation anyway. She asked me what my next move was. I told her that since I couldn't be a lazy heir, I'd just have to become a self-made billionaire instead. Leona just rolled her eyes and told me how sorry she felt for me. I took a sudden step toward her. She flinched and asked what I was doing. I reached out and pulled her collar aside, revealing the dark mark I'd left there. I asked her how it was possible that it hadn't faded yet. Leona turned bright red and slapped my hand away. She asked if I had any sense of decency, acting like that in the middle of the office. I just gave her my most innocent look and told her I was just concerned for her well-being. I asked her what else she expected from me. Her entire face was crimson now as she told me to stop acting like I was being nice. I just laughed and asked her what she meant. She asked me why I hadn't stopped the other night when she told me to. I stammered something stupid about thinking she was just playing hard to get. She gave me a look that could kill and told me that when she says no, she means it. I promised to be more careful in the future. Honestly, ending up in bed with her felt like the most natural thing in the world after she'd spent a week taking care of me. It happened after she cooked this massive dinner. We'd had a few drinks, and one thing just led to another. The day they finally kicked me out was beautiful and sunny. My father was practically vibrating with excitement as he waited for me to sign the final papers. He couldn't wait to see me walk out that door. I just nodded and stood up. As I walked toward the exit, half the office stood up and followed me. It was a hell of a sight, and I have to admit, it felt incredible. My father's smug expression vanished instantly. He demanded to know what was happening. One of his yes men stepped forward and told him not to worry, claiming that the people leaving were all dead weight, whose resignations he'd already approved. I just grinned at him and told him he'd just severed his own carotid artery. They didn't realize it yet, but Sterling Enterprises was a sinking ship. Alice was waiting for me in the lobby when I walked out. She told me to come with her and promised to help me get back on my feet. I just looked at her like she was crazy and asked why on earth I would ever go anywhere with her. She didn't like that. She started to say that since I had nothing left, I didn't have a choice. Before she could finish her sentence, Leona appeared out of nowhere. She draped herself over me, glaring at Alice with pure hostility. Leona reminded her that in a civilized society, you don't mess with another woman's man. Then she turned to me with a pout, acting like I'd promised to take care of her forever. She made me look like some heartbreaker in front of everyone. I just laughed and patted her head, promising her that I'd keep my word. Alice looked like she was about to explode as she watched us. She asked if I was actually with Leona, accusing me of lying to her. I didn't even bother answering. I just told her to stop harassing me. She tried to reach out and grab my arm, but Leona was already winding up a punch. I told her to stop, and she shot me a look of pure betrayal, asking if I was actually protecting Alice. I just sighed and told her I was protecting her, not Alice. I asked if she really wanted to go to jail for assault. Besides, I joked, who was going to make me dinner if she was behind bars? I started leading Leona toward the car. Alice screamed my name one last time, and I finally turned around to look at her. She looked like she was caught between wanting to kill me and wanting to beg me to stay. She threatened that if I walked away with Leona, we were done for good. I couldn't help but laugh at that. I told her that the moment she teamed up with my parents to ruin me, whatever connection we had was dead. She tried to argue, but I was done listening. Leona was clearly over it too. She playfully covered my ears so I couldn't hear Alice's shouting and clung to me. I just sighed and picked her up, carrying her to the car. My company, Apex Logistics, was doing great, and I'd never made any effort to keep my ownership a secret. It was only a matter of time before Alice figured it out. When she finally burst in my new office, she was shaking with rage and disappointment. She accused me of lying to her for years. I asked her exactly what she thought I'd lied about. She practically spat the name of my company at me. I told her she really should have done her homework before coming in here to make scene. I'd started Apex 3 years ago. I remember telling her all about my plans and my vision for the future, but she never actually listened to a word I said. She looked completely lost. She'd obviously tuned me out back then. She tried to guilt me, saying I'd abandoned the legacy my grandfather had left me. I just laughed and told her to get her facts straight. I asked her if she really thought I'd walked away by choice, or if she and my family had forced me out. She stammered that she hadn't wanted it to go that far. I told her she just wanted to see me crawl back to her. She clenched her fists, knowing I was right. I told her she should have known I wasn't the type to just roll over. She had tried to use the one thing I cared about to manipulate me into coming back. I told her I could almost respect the hustle, but I still didn't understand her motivation. Alice started shaking her head, looking like she was about to lose it. She admitted she was just angry and wanted me to come crawling back to her. She reminded me that we were supposed to be getting married and that I'd just ended it out of nowhere. She actually asked me why I was betraying her like this. The sheer absurdity of her words left me completely speechless. Before I could even open my mouth, Julian came charging into the room. He lunged at me, but Alice actually stepped in between us to stop him. He was screaming at me, asking if I'd forced Alice to come to my office. He had the nerve to ask how I could be so heartless as to fight my own brother over a woman. He started to say something about why Alice had really brought me back to the States, but she looked horrified and tried to cover his mouth. She threatened to end things with him right then and there if he said another word. Julian just looked at her like she'd lost her mind. He couldn't believe she was choosing me over him. The whole situation was so ridiculous, I couldn't help but laugh. That only made Julian angrier. He screamed at me, asking if I thought I'd won. I just gave him a serious nod and told him that seeing him this miserable was the highlight of my day. Julian was practically purple with rage. He mocked me, asking if I really believed that Alice actually had feelings for me. He told me that everything she'd done to save me was actually just a favor for him. Alice finally snapped and slapped him across the face as hard as she could. She was shaking all over, looking at me with pure panic in her eyes. Julian was watching me, waiting for me to fall apart. Alice was watching me like I was a ticking time bomb. But the truth was, I didn't feel anything at all. I just told them that I already knew. I remembered a conversation someone had with Alice about why she'd bothered to help me in the first place. They'd asked if she'd actually fallen for me, and she'd laughed it off. She said she didn't care if I lived or died. She just didn't want a police investigation into my parents that might end up hurting Julian's reputation. I'd actually recorded that conversation and kept on my phone, listening to it whenever I needed a reminder of who she really was. I hit play and let her hear her own voice. She turned as white as a sheet. She asked me why the hell I'd stayed with her if I knew the truth. I leaned back in my chair and took a second to think. I told her that I was probably just too young and desperate back then. After losing my grandparents and being stabbed in the back by my parents, I was just looking for a reason to keep going. Even if her kindness was a lie, it was the only kindness I had, so I let myself fall for her. But I eventually realized that loving her was a losing game. I remembered what my grandfather told me about how you have to fully grasp something before you can truly let it go. It was a simple lesson. You can't drop something you aren't holding. I realized that if I ever wanted to be free of her, I had to make her mine first. I told her that being with her was just the first step in my plan to finally walk away. Alice backed away from me, looking horrified. She asked if every single day we'd spent together was just a long game I was playing to dump her. I didn't say a word. She just kept shaking her head, insisting that I was lying and that I still loved her. I told her she was delusional. Right then, the door flew open and Leona's designer bag came sailing through the air, hitting Alice right in the shoulder. Alice let out a grunt and stumbled back. I moved just in time to catch Leona as she literally lunged at me. She was waving her arms around and screaming at the top of her lungs. Leona was furious, shouting about how she'd only been gone for 3 hours and Alice was already back to cause trouble. Alice was clutching her side, her face getting paler by the second. She asked me if this was all just some elaborate revenge plot. She tried to convince herself that Leona and I weren't a real couple and that I was just trying to hurt her. She finally broke down, saying she gave up and begging me to just come back to her. She promised she'd do whatever I wanted if I just came home. Leona was absolutely livid, struggling in my arms like a wild animal, trying to get at her. I looked at Alice through the chaos and told her she was overthinking things. There was no grand revenge plot. I simply didn't have any feelings for her anymore. I didn't stay to see Alice's face, but I heard Leona let out a triumphant laugh. She shouted for everyone to hear that I was hers now. She sounded like she'd just won the lottery. Security eventually dragged Alice and a very shaken Julian out of the building. I didn't care where they went. My only priority was trying to keep Leona from tearing the office apart. Leona was pacing the length of my office, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She demanded to know how Alice had even made it past the lobby. She asked if my security team was just there for decoration. She called the guards incompetent and told me I needed to fire the whole lot of them. She couldn't believe that a woman like Alice could just walk right in. Watching her pace was giving me a migraine. I asked her if she could just sit down for a second, but she just shot me a murderous look. She told me she was too pissed off to sit. I just sighed and asked her to let me hold her for a minute because I was exhausted. That actually made her stop. She hesitated for a beat before finally walking over. I pulled her onto my lap and wrapped my arms around her. For the first time all day, I felt a sense of peace. I asked her where she'd been all afternoon. She just said she had some business to take care of. It turns out Leona was a lot more than just my assistant. On top of working for me, she actually had a lead role at a high-end design studio. I was shocked to find out that my tough delivery girl was actually a classically trained designer. I decided to ask her something on a whim. I asked her if she wanted me to invest in her and help her open her own firm. She got this hesitant look on her face and told me there was something I needed to know. I immediately got suspicious. I joked and asked if she was cheating on me. She nearly jumped out of her skin, swearing that wasn't it. I asked her to just tell me what was going on. She grabbed a copy of a business magazine from my desk and pointed to the guy on the cover. She told me that was her father and that she already owned the design studio. She admitted she was exactly the kind of trust fund kid I'd been complaining about, the kind who should be living off her parents but insisted on doing her own thing. Life really does have a sense of humor. She told me her father had always seen her as the black sheep of the family. He'd pushed for business school, but she chose design. He wanted her to go to an Ivy League school, but she stayed home to train in martial arts. He expected her to take over the family empire, but she decided to build her own from scratch. She told me she wasn't just trying to be a rebel. She just had her own vision for her life. She'd been born into wealth, but she wanted to earn her own way. She realized that for her, starting a business was just a challenge, but for most people, it was a matter of survival. She told me about a brilliant classmate of hers who had so much potential. That girl had gotten married and had kids right after graduation. When Leona saw her again, she was working behind the counter at a 7-Eleven. This girl had the talent to design world-class fashion, and now she was just scanning barcodes. She was stuck doing soul-crushing, repetitive work. Leona told me she'd met too many women like that, women who were passed over because of their gender or their life choices. She just wanted to give them a real shot. I just stared at her for a moment. Then I asked her why the hell she'd been working as a delivery girl if she was so rich. Her face fell. She admitted she'd run out of cash and couldn't make payroll. She'd been working delivery jobs just to make sure her employees got paid. She just sighed and nodded. I looked at her and couldn't help but pat her head. I asked her how the business was doing lately. She looked even more depressed and told me it was failing. I told her to get all her financial records and reports together and bring them to me. She asked me what I was planning. I told her I'd take a look at the numbers. If the business was viable, I'd have Apex Logistics invest in it. And if it wasn't, I'd just fund it out of my own pocket. Leona squeezed me so hard I could barely breathe. She asked what would happen if the whole thing went under. I just kissed her and told her that if it failed, I had enough money to cover the loss. I told her I'd just have to work a little harder to make it back. Apex Logistics continued to expand exactly like I'd planned. In the meantime, I kept hearing rumors about what was happening over at Sterling Enterprises. They say a new leader always wants to make a mark, and the first thing my father did was build a custom studio for Julian. He spent a fortune poaching top-tier talent from other firms. He poured millions into marketing, just waiting for Julian to become a star. He even pulled some strings to land a massive government contract. While he was riding high on that success, my mother threw a huge, over-the-top gala to show off their new status. I was the only one who didn't get an invitation. Alice didn't show up either. Word on the street was that she and Julian had a massive falling out after the office incident. She ended up calling me one night, sounding completely wasted. Leona was already scrolling through my phone and asked if she could just block the number. I realized she was probably already doing it, but I just nodded and told her to go ahead. I heard that Alice had been trying to track me down, but I never actually saw her. I have to give Leona credit. She was a pro when it came to security. She eventually decided she deserved a reward for her hard work. She told me she wanted me to meet her parents. I was a nervous wreck, but her mother turned out to be incredibly sweet. Her father, on the other hand, seemed a little more skeptical of me. We swapped numbers before we left. On the drive home, I got a text from her father asking if I'd be interested in a position at his firm. Leona laughed and said her dad had finally given up on her and was trying to poach me to run the family business instead. She wondered aloud when he was finally going to stop trying to control her life. I thought about it for a second and suggested that we just have a kid and make it their problem instead. I joked that it would solve all our family business issues. Leona completely froze. She slammed on the brakes so hard I almost hit the dashboard. She turned to me, her face bright red, and asked me to repeat what I just said. I told her I was serious about solving the problem. I pulled out the ring I'd been carrying around and opened the box. I was surprised by how nervous I actually felt. I knew a car on the side of the road wasn't the most romantic setting, but the moment felt right. I told her I didn't want to wait another second. I asked Leona Vance if she would do me the honor of becoming my wife. Her eyes immediately welled up with tears. She lunged across the center console and hugged me, nodded her head over and over as she said yes. The Sterling family empire finally collapsed. The whole fantasy they'd built came crashing down in a matter of weeks. My father might have been a terrible businessman, but he wasn't a complete idiot. I never thought he'd be desperate enough to resort to bribery. It was clear that someone had seen the writing on the wall and decided to set him up. It was a simple trap, and he walked right into it. He was caught up in a $20 million scandal, enough to put him away for a long time. My mother tracked me down and demanded that I pay whatever it took to get him out. I just looked at her, genuinely amused by the request. I asked her how she expected me to fix a federal crime. She just scoffed and said everything had a price, accusing me of being too cheap to help my own father. She reminded me that my grandfather had made me promise to look after the family. I told her that his definition of looking after meant making sure they didn't starve, and that was as far as I was willing to go. I warned her not to do anything stupid while the feds were watching. Of course, she never listened to me. 3 days later, she was being hauled into a police station. She was charged with trespassing and disorderly conduct. It was pretty obvious she'd tried to bribe an official, and they'd immediately called the cops. The police called me to come post her bail. The only reason she wasn't facing more serious charges was because the official didn't want the headache of a trial. Even after all that, my mother still insisted she'd done nothing wrong. I was so fed up I just started laughing. I told her to keep it up so she could join my father in a cell. She finally went quiet and grabbed my sleeve, looking desperate. She asked me if I was really going to just abandon my father. I pushed her hand away and told her there was nothing I could do for him. Then she started asking about the company, reminding me it was my grandfather's legacy. I looked at her, wondering what she was really getting at. I asked her what she'd done. She couldn't even look me in the eye as she claimed she hadn't done anything. She started rambling about some sure thing investment she'd heard about. She actually suggested that since it was a family business, I should just use my own money to cover the massive hole she'd helped create. I just backed away and gave her a look of pure disgust. I told her that her financial mess was her problem, not mine. She tried to argue that it was my company now, but I just reminded her that she had another son she could go to for help. That finally shut her up. I only mentioned Julian to be spiteful. I never thought she'd actually take the suggestion seriously. Later that night, Alice called me from an unknown number. I was about to hang up when she frantically told me that Julian had just shown up at her place. My silence must have given her some kind of hope. She started talking a mile a minute, telling me that Julian and my mother had come to her begging for money to pay off their debts. She kept emphasizing that she'd turned them down and hadn't given them a cent. After a long pause, I told her that she probably should have helped them. I told her that if she'd helped him, I might have at least believed she was capable of loving someone. But now, it was clear she didn't care about anyone but herself. She started crying, swearing that she loved me. She kept sobbing that she loved me and begged me to come back. She promised she'd never speak to Julian again if I just gave her another chance. I told her to never contact me again. I told her that hearing my name come out of her mouth made me sick. My grandfather had given me that name because it meant being broad-minded and strong enough to survive in a cruel world. It was a name that carried the weight of the only people who had ever truly loved me. I only wanted to hear that name from someone I actually cared about. Leona asked me shyly if she could call me Joe while she was holding on to me. I turned around and asked her if she really loved me. She just whispered that she loved me over and over. We ended up getting married about a year later. It was a busy year for both of us. My father was finally sentenced to prison, and Sterling Enterprises officially went bankrupt. My mother ended up in the hospital after a horrific car accident. Apparently, Julian had pushed her during an argument after Alice had finally left the country for good. He'd panicked and tried to sell off everything they had left so he could flee the country. My mother, however, had refused to let him go. She was still delusional enough to think she could remain a Chicago socialite. She thought they could just patch the holes in the company's finances, not realizing that the entire foundation had already rotted away. The money she'd embezzled wasn't even a drop in the bucket. The two of them ended up in a screaming match over what was left, and Julian pushed her. No one really knows if he meant to do it. She stumbled into the street and was hit by a car. It was a hit and run, and Julian was so terrified he just ran away instead of calling for help. By the time she was found, the damage was done. She ended up permanently paralyzed. I quietly arranged for her to be moved into a long-term care facility. Julian didn't get far. The police caught him at the airport trying to board a flight to Mexico. Leona and I were there when they brought him in. He was screaming, asking what we wanted from him. I just gave him a dark smile and told him I didn't want anything at all. I told him I was just making sure he had a roof over his head and 3 meals a day. He was terrified, swearing that he hadn't meant to hurt our mother and begging me not to send him to prison. Leona just shook her head and told him that prison was far too good for someone like him. We'd actually arranged a much more fitting living situation for him, right in the room next to our mother. I told him he could spend his days keeping her company. Julian didn't exactly take the news well. I gave him an ultimatum. If he ever tried to leave that facility, I'd personally call his ex-wife and tell her exactly where to find him. I knew she'd been looking for him for months. I told him to choose between our mother and his ex-Julian was absolutely petrified. His ex-wife was notoriously unstable and had a history of violence. He knew that if she ever got her hands on him, he wouldn't survive the night. He was the one who had cheated on her, and he knew she was out for blood. He had no choice but to stay put. He tried to tell himself that living in a nice facility with our mother wouldn't be that bad. He realized pretty quickly how wrong he was. Our mother had completely lost her mind and spent every waking moment screaming at him. She blamed him for the accident and tried to hit him whenever he got close. He kept trying to tell her it wasn't his fault, but she wouldn't listen. She started telling him she wished she'd never had him and that I was the only son she should have kept. Julian just laughed in her face, telling her that I'd never take her back. He reminded her of all the times she'd abused me, like the time she pushed me down the stairs or burned me with her cigarettes. He told her I hadn't forgotten a single second of it. She screamed that it was all his fault because he'd lied to her about me bullying him. Julian just laughed even harder at that. He told her he was just a kid and that she only believed him because she already hated me. He admitted that watching her treat me like that had actually terrified him. He'd been afraid that if he ever lost his golden boy status, she'd turn on him too. He'd spent his whole life framing me just to stay on her good side. The two of them spent their days tearing each other apart, bringing up every terrible thing they'd ever done. Leona couldn't even finish watching the security footage. She was so angry, she ended up breaking a table in the break room just to vent. When we got home that night, she just held on to me like she was never going to let go. I just let her get it all out. Once I finished up some emails, I asked her what was really bothering her. She just shook her head and told me it was nothing. I told her that if watching the footage made her that upset, she should just stop. She froze, realizing I'd known she was watching. I just laughed and gave her a little nudge. I told her I'd figured it out when she didn't come back to the office for an hour. She apologized for spying on them, but I just pulled her into a hug. I told her I wasn't angry and that she didn't need to apologize. I already knew exactly what they were saying to each other. I just didn't want her carrying that weight for me. Leona was genuinely devastated for me. She told me she wished she'd found me years ago so she could have protected me. It was the sweetest thing anyone had ever said to me. I told her that it didn't matter when she showed up, as long as she was here now. She squeezed me tight and told me not to be sad. I couldn't help but laugh at how much she cared. I told her I was honestly fine. The worst of the pain was from when I was a kid and still actually wanted them to love me. After getting burned enough times, I'd finally learned to stop reaching for them. I'd spent my adult life avoiding them, and I knew my grandparents had already settled the score in their own way. I never felt like I was unlucky. Even if my parents were monsters, I'd had my grandparents, and now I had her. I'd been through hell, but I'd also been loved more than most people ever are. I had everything I ever wanted right here. Life is never going to be perfect, but having this much is more than enough for me.